The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stone steps of St. Margaret's Cathedral as Queen Elizabeth adjusted her pearl necklace one final time. The weight of tradition pressed down on her shoulders like the heavy velvet cloak she wore for state occasions. Today's service had been different, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Prince William stood beside her, his jaw set in a firm line that reminded her painfully of his father during difficult times. The young prince had been unusually quiet throughout the morning prayers, his responses to the liturgy coming a beat too late, as if his mind wandered elsewhere entirely. "Your Majesty." Archbishop Morrison approached with careful steps, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. The elderly clergyman had served the royal family for over 2 decades, yet today something flickered in his eyes that Elizabeth had never seen before. Was it disappointment? Or perhaps something more troubling? The congregation had begun filing out through the massive oak doors, their whispered conversations creating a soft murmur that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Lady Catherine walked past, her usual warm smile replaced by a concerned frown. Even the palace guards seemed tense, their posture more rigid than usual. Elizabeth noticed how the morning light filtered through the stained glass windows differently today. The colored patterns that usually brought her comfort now seemed to cast strange shadows across the altar. She had attended this same service every Sunday for 30 years, yet today felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. Prince Harry emerged from the side chapel where he had been speaking with several church elders. His face was pale, and he avoided making eye contact with his grandmother. Something had clearly shaken him during their private conversation. The young prince, who usually brought levity to even the most solemn occasions, now moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying heavy news. "Perhaps we should return to the palace, Your Majesty," suggested Sir James, the Queen's private secretary. His voice carried an urgency that made Elizabeth's stomach tighten with apprehension. In all her years of public service, she had learned to read the subtle signs of crisis in the faces of those around her. The cathedral, which had witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies, christenings, and memorials, now felt suffocating. The familiar smell of incense that usually brought her peace instead seemed cloying and overwhelming. Elizabeth found herself longing for the fresh air beyond these ancient walls. As they moved toward the exit, she caught fragments of hushed conversations from the remaining congregation members. Words like unprecedented and shocking revelation drifted through the air like smoke. Her trained ear, sharpened by decades of political intrigue, picked up the tension in their voices. The Queen's lady-in-waiting, Margaret, appeared at her elbow with a gentle touch. "Ma'am, the car is ready whenever you are." But her usual efficiency was tinged with something else today, a protective urgency that spoke of storms brewing beyond the cathedral doors. Prince William finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Grandmother, we need to talk privately once we're home. There are things—" He paused, struggling with words. "Things have come to light that will change everything." Elizabeth felt her heart skip a beat. In 70 years of royal duty, she had weathered scandals, political upheavals, and personal tragedies. But William's tone suggested something different entirely, something that threatened the very foundations of everything she held sacred. The cathedral bells began their familiar chime, marking the end of service. But instead of their usual comforting resonance, today they sounded almost ominous, as if tolling for something that was ending rather than celebrating something beginning. Archbishop Morrison caught up with them near the doors. "Your Majesty, I do hope you'll consider what we discussed. These are delicate matters that require careful consideration." His diplomatic language couldn't mask the gravity in his voice. Elizabeth nodded curtly, her training kicking in even as her mind raced with possibilities. Whatever had transpired during the service, whatever revelations had come to light, she knew that stepping outside these cathedral doors would mark the beginning of a journey into uncharted territory. The Queen's security detail formed their usual protective formation, but she noticed additional personnel stationed at strategic points around the cathedral grounds. Something significant enough to warrant increased security had clearly occurred, though she had been shielded from the immediate details. As they approached the threshold, Elizabeth took one last look back at the altar where she had knelt in prayer countless times. The golden cross that had been her spiritual anchor seemed somehow distant now, as if viewing it through a fog of uncertainty that had suddenly descended upon her carefully ordered world. Prince Harry moved closer to her side. "Grandmother, whatever happens next, please remember that some truths are worth the upheaval they bring." His words carried the weight of conviction, but also a plea for understanding that made her wonder just how dramatically their lives were about to change. The massive wooden doors creaked open, and bright sunlight flooded the cathedral entrance. Beyond the threshold waited not just their waiting cars, but a future that none of them could have anticipated when they had entered for morning prayers just hours before. The Rolls-Royce pulled away from St. Margaret's Cathedral with unusual haste. Elizabeth sat in the rear seat, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap as she watched the familiar London streets blur past the tinted windows. The silence inside the vehicle was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional crackle from the security radio in the front seat. Prince William sat across from her, his phone buzzing constantly with messages he ignored. The young prince stared out the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. Every few moments, he would open his mouth as if to speak, then close it again, clearly struggling with how to begin explaining what had transpired in the cathedral's private chambers. The archbishop seemed particularly troubled today. Elizabeth finally ventured, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She had spent decades mastering the art of drawing information from reluctant sources, and she sensed that direct approach might be necessary here. William's shoulders sagged slightly. "Grandmother, what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible. When the archbishop called me aside after the service, he showed me documents that..." He paused, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that reminded her painfully of Diana. "Documents that call into question everything we thought we knew about our family's history." The Queen's training kept her face impassive, but her pulse quickened. In her long reign, she had seen forgeries, conspiracy theories, and attempts to undermine the monarchy through fabricated evidence. But William's obvious distress suggested this was something far more serious than the usual palace intrigue. "What sort of documents?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. "Marriage certificates, birth records, legal documents dating back to the 1940s. William's words came out in a rush now, as if a dam had burst. Archbishop Morrison's predecessor apparently sealed them in the cathedral archives before his death. They were only discovered during recent restoration work in the cathedral's foundation. Elizabeth felt the world tilt slightly. The 1940s, the time of her parents' reign, the war years, the period when so many records had been lost or deliberately destroyed to protect state secrets. But what could possibly have been hidden that would warrant such secrecy? The car turned into the palace gates, but instead of feeling relief at returning home, Elizabeth felt as though she was entering a trap. The familiar sight of the palace guards and the well-manicured gardens now seemed like stage props in a play whose script had suddenly changed without warning. "William, you must tell me everything. Now." Her voice carried the authority of decades of rule, but underneath lay a grandmother's concern for the obvious pain her grandson was experiencing. Prince William pulled a sealed envelope from his jacket pocket. His hands trembled slightly as he held out to her. "The Archbishop insisted you see these personally. He said they could change the line of succession entirely." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. The line of succession was the bedrock upon which the entire monarchy rested. Any challenge to its legitimacy would send shockwaves through not just Britain, but the entire Commonwealth. She took the envelope with steady hands, though inside, her heart hammered against her ribs. "Before you open that," William continued, "you should know that Harry already knows." The Archbishop felt it was necessary to inform both of us simultaneously. That's why he seemed so distant during the service. The car pulled to a stop in the palace courtyard. Through the windows, Elizabeth could see her staff waiting to attend to her usual post-service routine. Afternoon tea, a review of the following week's schedule, perhaps a walk through the gardens. All of it now seemed like relics from a simpler time. Sir James appeared at the car door, his face carefully neutral but his eyes betraying deep concern. "Your Majesty, the Prime Minister has requested an urgent audience. He's waiting in the blue drawing room with several members of his cabinet." Elizabeth's mind raced. If the government was already involved, then whatever was in the envelope had implications that reached far beyond the palace walls. The careful balance between the monarchy and the elected government, maintained through centuries of tradition and compromise, was apparently under threat. "How much do they know?" she asked William. Archbishop Morrison felt obligated to inform the palace secretary first, as a matter of protocol. "I assume word reached Downing Street within hours." William's voice carried a note of resignation. "Grandmother, there's something else. The documents don't just concern our family. They implicate several prominent political families as well. People who have shaped Britain's modern history." Elizabeth finally understood why the morning had felt so strange, why even the cathedral itself had seemed different. They hadn't just attended a church service. They had witnessed the beginning of a constitutional crisis that could reshape the very foundations of British society. "Ma'am," Sir James said gently, "I'm afraid there are also representatives from the Commonwealth offices requesting immediate consultation. Australia, Canada, and New Zealand have all expressed urgent concerns." The Queen realized that the sealed envelope in her hands contained more than family secrets. It held information that could potentially destabilize not just the British monarchy, but the political structure of multiple nations that still recognized her as their sovereign. As she stepped from the car, Elizabeth caught sight of Prince Charles emerging from side entrance, his face grim and his usual confident demeanor noticeably absent. Behind him walked several men in dark suits whom she didn't recognize, likely government legal advisors or intelligence officials. The weight of the envelope felt enormous in her hands. Whatever truth lay within those pages, she knew that reading it would mark the end of the world as she had known it for 7 decades. The palace, with its ancient stones and centuries of tradition, suddenly felt fragile, as if built on foundations of sand rather than solid rock. "Your Majesty," Sir James said quietly as they approached the palace entrance, "perhaps it would be wise to review the documents privately before meeting with the government officials. Once this becomes a matter of state, there will be no going back." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the gravity of his suggestion. In a few minutes, she would need to decide not just how to protect her family, but how to preserve the institution that had defined her entire life. The morning's church service, which had begun as a routine act of faith, had somehow become the catalyst for the greatest challenge the monarchy had faced in modern times. Elizabeth retreated to her private study, a sanctuary lined with leather-bound books and photographs of 7 decades of royal history. Her hand still trembled slightly as she broke the Archbishop's seal on the envelope. The familiar scent of old parchment wafted up as she carefully extracted the documents, each page bearing official seals and signatures that looked disturbingly authentic. The first document made her breath catch in her throat. It was a marriage certificate dated 1943, bearing the name of her father, King George VI. But this wasn't the marriage certificate to her mother that she had seen countless times in family archives. This one bore the name of another woman entirely, Lady Margaret Ashworth, daughter of a prominent Scottish noble family. Elizabeth's mind reeled as she absorbed the implications. If this document was genuine, it meant her father had been married before meeting her mother. But that wasn't the most shocking revelation. According to the birth certificate that followed, this first marriage had produced a son, born 6 months before Elizabeth herself. "Impossible," she whispered to the empty room. But even as she spoke, fragments of half-remembered conversations began falling into place. Whispered discussions between her parents that stopped abruptly when she entered rooms. Her father's inexplicable melancholy during certain times of year. Her mother's occasional sharp responses to innocent questions about family history. The study door opened quietly, and Prince Charles entered, his face pale and drawn. "Mother, I've just finished speaking with the constitutional lawyers. If these documents are authentic." He couldn't finish the sentence. Then, "Your Uncle David was not the only one who abdicated royal responsibility," Elizabeth completed, her voice hollow. The revelation that her uncle had given up the throne for love had been the defining crisis of her youth. Now it seemed there had been an even greater secret hidden in the shadows. Charles sat heavily in the chair across from her desk. "The lawyers say that under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, father's first marriage would have required parliamentary consent. If he married without it, the union would be legally void, but if Parliament did consent, then his firstborn son would be the legitimate heir," Elizabeth finished. The constitutional implications were staggering. Not only would her own claim to the throne be illegitimate, but the entire line of succession would need to be recalculated based on a man who might not even be alive. Elizabeth turned to the third document with growing dread. It was a death certificate for Lady Margaret Ashworth, dated 1944, listing cause of death as complications from influenza. But clipped to this document was a note in what looked like her father's handwriting. "The boy lives. He must never know. The burden of kingship has already cost too much. Where's this son now?" Charles asked, though his tone suggested he feared the answer. Elizabeth pulled out the final document, a letter dated just 5 years ago, addressed to Archbishop Morrison from a law firm in Edinburgh. In careful legal language, it described their representation of one James Ashworth Mountbatten, who had recently learned of his royal heritage through family documents discovered after his adoptive mother's death. "He's been alive all this time," Elizabeth said, her voice barely audible. "Father gave him away to protect the monarchy, and now he's 65 years old and has spent his entire life believing he was an orphan war baby," Charles finished. "Mother, according to this letter, he's been a university professor, married with children. He has no idea he's technically the rightful king of England." Elizabeth set the documents down with shaking hands. The man who should have inherited her father's throne had lived an ordinary life as an academic, while she had carried the burden of royal duty for 7 decades based on what now appeared to be a lie. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sir James entered, his usual composed demeanor cracked with strain. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid the situation has become more complicated. The Prime Minister has just informed me that this James Ashworth Mountbatten contacted his office 6 months ago through proper legal channels." Elizabeth felt the room spinning around her. What did he want? Initially, nothing more than historical clarification. He had discovered documents suggesting a family connection to the royal house and wanted to verify their authenticity through proper channels. The government has been quietly investigating his claims ever since. Charles stood abruptly, beginning to pace. 6 months they've known about this, and they said nothing. The Prime Minister's office felt it was crucial to verify the claims before potentially destabilizing the monarchy, Sir James explained. Their investigation has confirmed the authenticity of most of the documents. The marriage between King George VI and Lady Margaret Ashworth appears to have been a wartime necessity, a political alliance to secure Scottish support during the darkest days of the war. Elizabeth understood now why the morning's church service had felt so significant. Archbishop Morrison hadn't just discovered old papers during cathedral restoration. He had been drawn into a constitutional crisis that had been building for months behind closed doors. "What does this man want now?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would shatter what remained of her carefully ordered world. Sir James hesitated before answering. "Professor Ashworth Mountbatten has filed a formal petition with the House of Lords, requesting recognition of his legitimate claim to the throne. He's not demanding immediate abdication, but he wants acknowledgement of his legal rights and a formal discussion about the future of the monarchy." The weight of 7 decades on the throne suddenly felt crushing. Elizabeth had devoted her life to an institution that might have been built on a foundation of necessary lies. Every decision she had made, every sacrifice her family had endured, every moment of public service, all of it now called into question by documents hidden in a cathedral wall. There's something else, Charles said quietly. William showed me additional correspondence. This Professor Ashworth Mountbatten has children and grandchildren. If his claim is legitimate, then his entire family line has precedence over ours. Elizabeth closed her eyes, trying to imagine explaining to her great-grandchildren that their royal heritage was built on a 7-decade-old cover-up. The institution she had spent her life protecting might need to be completely rebuilt, or perhaps abolished entirely if the British people lost faith in its legitimacy. The afternoon sun slanted through the study windows, casting long shadows across the documents that had turned her world upside down. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of palace life continuing. Staff members going about their duties, tourists gathering at the gates, the changing of the guard. None of them yet knew that the monarchy itself was facing the greatest challenge in its 1,000-year history. 3 hours later, the blue drawing room had been transformed into an emergency command center. Elizabeth sat at the head of an enormous mahogany table, surrounded by the most powerful figures in British government. The Prime Minister, David Cameron Hughes, shuffled through copies of the cathedral documents while constitutional lawyers whispered urgently among themselves. Your Majesty, the Prime Minister began carefully, we find ourselves in unprecedented territory. Professor Ashworth Mountbatten has agreed to meet with government representatives tomorrow, but his legal team is remarkably well prepared. They've been building their case for months. Elizabeth studied the faces around the table. These were people she had worked with for decades. Yet today, they looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and calculation that made her stomach turn. She could see them already weighing the political costs of supporting a potentially illegitimate monarchy against the chaos that would follow its dissolution. What do we know about this man's character? She asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. Home Secretary Margaret Thornton consulted her notes. Professor James Ashworth Mountbatten, age 65, Emeritus Professor of Medieval History at Edinburgh University. Married for 40 years to Dr. Catherine Ashworth, a retired physician. 3 children, all accomplished professionals. No criminal record, no political extremism, no apparent desire for wealth or power. In other words, Charles interjected bitterly, he appears to be everything a modern king should be, educated, stable, and untainted by scandal. The Attorney General, Sir Robert Blackwood, cleared his throat. Your Majesty, I must inform you that Professor Ashworth Mountbatten has made it clear he has no desire to destroy the monarchy. His petition suggests a unique solution, a formal acknowledgement of the historical truth, followed by a voluntary transfer of succession rights back to your family line. Elizabeth felt a flicker of hope. He would renounce his claim? Not exactly, Sir Robert continued. He proposes what he calls a constitutional reconciliation. Public acknowledgement of the historical circumstances, a formal apology for the decades-long concealment, and then a democratic process allowing the British people to choose whether to continue with the current royal family or transition to his line. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. It wasn't just a question of royal legitimacy anymore. Professor Ashworth Mountbatten was proposing to put the entire future of the monarchy to a popular vote. Prince William spoke for the first time since arriving at the palace. Has anyone actually met this man? Spoken with him directly? The Prime Minister nodded grimly. I had a preliminary phone conversation with him yesterday evening. He's remarkably reasonable. Actually, he expressed genuine concern for the current royal family and said he had no desire to cause personal pain. But he also believes that democracy requires truth, even when that truth is inconvenient. Elizabeth absorbed this information with growing dread. She had faced many challenges during her reign, but they had all been external threats, political crises, economic downturns, family scandals. This challenge came from within the very foundations of her authority, and it was being led by someone who appeared to hold the moral high ground. What are his demands for this meeting tomorrow? She asked. Sir Robert consulted his papers. He wants to meet with you personally, Your Majesty. Just the two of you, with minimal legal representation. He says this is fundamentally a family matter that has become entangled with constitutional law. The idea of meeting face-to-face with the man who might be her father's legitimate heir filled Elizabeth with a complex mixture of emotions. Part of her was curious about this half-brother she had never known existed. Another part was terrified of what she might see in his face, perhaps her father's features, or a bearing that spoke of the royal dignity he had never been allowed to claim. Prince Harry, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke. What if he's right? What if the people deserve to know the truth and make their own choice about the monarchy's future? The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Charles shot his younger son a warning look, but Harry continued, "I'm serious. We spent our entire lives talking about service to the people. Maybe true service means giving them the choice rather than maintaining a system built on concealment." Elizabeth studied her grandson's face and recognized something she had seen in his mother, a willingness to challenge convention when conscience demanded it. Diana had often pushed the royal family toward greater transparency and connection with ordinary people. Now Harry seemed to be suggesting they take that principle to its ultimate conclusion. "Your Majesty," the Prime Minister said carefully, "we need to consider the international implications as well. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the other Commonwealth realms are all watching the situation closely. If the legitimacy of the British Crown is called into question, it could trigger constitutional crises across multiple nations." Elizabeth realized that the secret her father had tried to protect through concealment might ultimately destroy everything he had hoped to preserve. The monarchy he had strengthened through wartime leadership could be torn apart by the very lies he had told to keep it stable. "There's another factor we must consider," Sir Robert added quietly. "Professor Ashworth Mountbatten has indicated that if his claims are acknowledged, he would advocate for significant constitutional reforms. A more democratic monarchy, reduced royal privileges, greater transparency in royal finances. His vision is of a crown that serves rather than reigns." Elizabeth felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Every choice before her seemed to lead toward the end of the monarchy as she had known it. Whether through public revelation of the historical deception, a transfer of legitimacy to her half-brother's line, or radical democratic reforms, the institution she had devoted her life to serving would emerge fundamentally changed. "Ma'am," Sir James said gently, "we need a decision about tomorrow's meeting. Professor Ashworth Mountbatten is prepared to make his case public if private negotiations fail. The story will eventually emerge regardless. The question is whether we shape that narrative or allow others to control it." Elizabeth looked around the table at faces that represented the power structure of modern Britain. Prime ministers, judges, military officers, and advisors, all of them ultimately dependent on the legitimacy of the crown for their own authority. Yet she found herself thinking about ordinary British citizens who had trusted the monarchy for generations, never knowing that its foundations rested on wartime deceptions and family secrets. "I'll meet with him," she said finally, "tomorrow afternoon, here at the palace. Just the two of us, as he requested." The decision felt both terrifying and liberating. After 7 decades of carrying other people's secrets, Elizabeth was finally going to confront the truth about her own inheritance, and perhaps discover what kind of man her father's hidden son had become. Professor James Ashworth Mountbatten arrived at Buckingham Palace precisely at 2 o'clock the following afternoon. Elizabeth watched from her study window as he emerged from a modest black sedan, declining the assistance of palace staff as he adjusted his simple gray suit and approached the entrance. He moved with quiet dignity, neither rushing nor hesitating, and something in his posture reminded her painfully of her father during his most thoughtful moments. When Sir James escorted him into her private study, Elizabeth felt as though she were looking into a mirror that reflected not her own image, but echoes of family she had never known existed. Professor Ashworth Mountbatten was tall and silver-haired, with the same strong jawline that had characterized her father's portraits, but his eyes held a gentleness that spoke of a life lived without the burden of royal duty. "Your Majesty," he said, offering a respectful bow that was neither too shallow nor too deep. His voice carried the educated accent of Scottish academia, but underneath it ran currents of something more complex, perhaps the carefully controlled emotions of a man who had spent months preparing for this moment. Professor Ashworth Mountbatten, Elizabeth replied, gesturing toward the chair across from her desk. Please sit. I believe we have a great deal to discuss. He settled into the chair with the comfortable ease of someone accustomed to faculty meetings and academic conferences, yet Elizabeth noticed how his eyes took in the royal portraits on the walls, not with the hungry fascination of someone seeking wealth or power, but with the careful attention of a historian examining primary sources. I want you to know, he began, his words carefully measured, that I never wanted any of this. When I first discovered the documents among my adoptive mother's papers, I hoped they would prove to be elaborate forgeries or family myths. Elizabeth studied his face, searching for signs of deception or ambition, but found only the weary honesty of someone carrying unwanted knowledge. What changed your mind? Professional integrity, he said simply. I've spent my career teaching students to seek truth regardless of its convenience. When the evidence mounted that these documents were authentic, I couldn't simply ignore them because they complicated my comfortable life. They sat in silence for a moment, two people separated by 7 decades of different lives, but united by blood they had only recently learned they shared. Elizabeth found herself wondering what kind of king he might have been, what different path British history might have taken with his steady academic temperament instead of her dutiful formality. Tell me about your life, she said, surprising herself with the request. The life my father's decision gave you. Professor Ashworth Mountbatten smiled for the first time since entering the room, and Elizabeth saw in that expression a warmth that royal protocol had never quite allowed her to develop. I was fortunate. My adoptive parents, the Ashworths, were kind people who couldn't have children of their own. They gave me love, education, and the freedom to choose my own path. I became a teacher because I wanted to help young people understand the past. I never imagined I was part of the history I was teaching. Do you resent the choice that was made for you? Elizabeth asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. How can I resent a decision that gave me 65 years of happiness? He replied thoughtfully. I had a childhood filled with books instead of protocols, a marriage based on love rather than state necessity, children who knew their father as a person rather than an institution. In many ways, I received the better bargain. Elizabeth felt tears threatening for the first time since this crisis began. The generosity of his response highlighted everything she had sacrificed for duty. The spontaneous affection that had been constrained by royal reserve, the simple pleasures that had been surrendered to public obligation, the authentic relationships that had been complicated by the weight of the crown. Then, why pursue this now, she asked. If you've been happier outside the monarchy, why risk destroying what exists? Professor Ashworth Mountbatten leaned forward slightly, his academic training evident in the careful way he organized his thoughts. Because democracy requires informed consent. The British people have supported the monarchy for generations, believing it represented legitimate succession and constitutional stability. They deserve to know the truth, and then they deserve to choose what comes next. And what do you think should come next? That's not for me to decide alone, he said. But I believe the monarchy could be stronger if it were more honest. Instead of succession based on centuries-old bloodlines and hidden secrets, why not a crown that earns its legitimacy through service and democratic support? Elizabeth realized that this quiet professor was proposing something revolutionary. Not the abolition of the monarchy, but its transformation into something that had never existed before, a truly democratic royal institution. You understand, she said carefully, that what you're suggesting would change everything. Not just for our family, but for the entire Commonwealth. I do understand that. It's why I've moved so carefully, why I've sought legal and constitutional advice every step of the way. This isn't about personal ambition or revenge for my father's decision. It's about creating space for the monarchy to evolve rather than eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Elizabeth found herself impressed despite her fears. This man, who might have been king, possessed the thoughtful leadership style that she had tried to model throughout her own reign, but he combined it with a democratic sensibility that her royal training had never allowed her to fully embrace. "What do you propose we do now?" she asked. Professor Ashworth Mountbatten pulled a folder from his briefcase. "I've prepared a proposal for what I call constitutional reconciliation. Public acknowledgement of the historical truth, a formal apology for the concealment, and then a national conversation about what kind of monarchy Britain wants in the 21st century. Whether that's your family line, my family line, or something entirely new would be up to the people to decide." Elizabeth accepted the folder with hands that trembled slightly. Inside were detailed plans for a process that would essentially put the monarchy on trial before the court of public opinion. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. "And if the people choose to end the monarchy altogether?" she asked. "Then we'll have given them that choice honestly, instead of forcing them to discover the truth in ways that might destroy their faith in democratic institutions entirely," he replied. "Sometimes the only way to save something is to be willing to lose it." Elizabeth closed the folder and looked across at this man who might be her half-brother, who certainly possessed a stronger legal claim to her throne, and who has offered her something no one else ever had: the choice to redefine what royal service could mean in a modern democracy. For the first time since leaving the cathedral the previous morning, Elizabeth felt a spark of hope. The revelation that had threatened to destroy everything might instead provide an opportunity to build something better. The morning's church service, which had seemed to mark the beginning of the end, might actually have marked the beginning of a new kind of beginning. "Professor Ashworth Mountbatten," she said formally, "I believe it's time we told the truth.